everyone. This is Nick with Tenacity.ai with my co-host Jason. Today we're going to dive into FinOps key concepts and terminology, continuing our series on FinOps and the journey to FinOps. And I think this is important to cover early on because one of the first steps in any endeavor is really defining your vocabulary to help people communicate. And when we're communicating across, finance and DevOps, being able to bring those two teams together in a common set of a common dictionary, I think is pretty important. So to kick this off, I'm going to actually ask the question first, Jason. What are the areas, or can you help frame up this conversation of what sorts of vocabulary we need to help organizations when we're implementing FinOps? What sorts of vocabulary do we need to help our organizations think about?
Well, there's a handful of terms, and these terms can vary in how they're presented based on the type of provider that you're using, right? So as an example, on AWS calls their public pricing on-demand pricing. Azure calls their public pricing pay-as-you-go, right? So there's some generic concepts that the providers have that mean the same thing that you obviously need to map out. And I think you touched on it. What's really important, because FinOps is trying to bring the entire organization together, bring the people that are spending the cloud, right, and using it into the people, in with the people that are paying for it. You'll find that a lot of times that the concepts that are used from a technical perspective aren't known across the finance team, and the terms that the finance team are using are not common terms that the engineers are using. And so FinOps, I think, as they go through, they define maybe 25, 30 terms that we all need to get on the same page with, that span both engineering and finance. And some of them are easy to understand, and some of them are a little less easy to understand. So we picked out a handful of them to talk about today. And I think probably be good to start with the one that you were also confused or didn't really understand right, or didn't understand right when you looked at it. You were like, man, it
doesn't make sense to read it. It doesn't make any sense to
talk
look at
about
it.
Blended versus unblended in the AWS world.
Right. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this is confusing even for, as an engineer, when you look at it and you're looking in the billing file, it is a weird, in my opinion, it's a weird label for what the costs actually mean. And so, blended versus unblended, we have often, when we've run into problems reconciling a bill, it's been because of confusing maybe these two terms or confusing these two fields. Unblended is simply a categorization for costs, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is simply a categorization for costs that may have different billing rates the more that you use them. So you may see a decrease in your billing rate over usage and time during the month. And that's what the unblended cost is actually showing in the billing period. It may be more upfront and it may be less as you use it over time. Whereas blended is, I believe, taking and smoothing that out. Now blended then is kind of, to be perfectly honest, blended is kind of useless. So for the finance folks out there, and probably for some of the engineers as well, the blended cost, the only time you would use it is actually reconciling an invoice, I think. Otherwise, you're not going to use it at all. You're going to use unblended.
Rare use cases. Yeah, unblended is the one, that's the one that you need to use if you want to get down to true unit economics. What does this resource cost me? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because that's, those are, unblended is the way to go, unless you're just trying to, like you said, reconcile invoices at the end of the month,
right.
Which, it's just not utilized across the board.
Yeah, and I think if I were to jump to another one that I think is, it's not necessarily confusing the terminology itself, but there are many different terms that folks use, and it's really important in your organization to find one term to use so you're all speaking the same language, and that's cost allocation. Because cost allocation will get called shared costs, it'll get called divided costs, cost attribution, bill back, charge back, show back. There is a number of terms that can each have their own meanings, by the way, but a lot of times when folks are using them, they're using them in relation to cost allocation. So Jason, when should we use these terms, and maybe frame up what cost allocation actually is?
Cost allocation, I guess, to me, it is the process that helps you achieve all of the other things that you mentioned there, like show back, bill back, charge back, some other things that you mentioned there. And it is, frankly, the process of taking everything that you have in your environment and allocating it to the appropriate business groups or customers or whatever is in the context of the customer that makes sense, right? Could be environments, prod, dev, UAT. It could be broken up that way, but it's taking everything that I have in my environment and allocating those costs to the appropriate divisions, units, whatever I'm going to divide those up in whatever way I need to understand them in the future. And then from allocating your environment, you may have some resources, as you mentioned, that are shared, that can't just be allocated to one specific thing. So I have, a networking account that I evenly share across all of my allocation groups, as an example, as a really simplistic example. And then the ability to show back charges to those individual business units is driven by making sure that you've allocated those costs out. So it's the first step in getting the true visibility into the environment that you need to support all of those other things.
Yeah, and I would think if I were to sum it up into a sentence and relate it back to what we've talked about before in the FinOps lifecycle, it's mapping the billing data to your business. It's as simple as that. Cost allocation is mapping the billing data to your business. It drives accountability. It allows you to get to the rest of the things. But that term gets so loaded that people start to think about it like it's shared cost or start to think about it like it's chargeback. And it's really important. It's not. It's the foundation of those things. No, so absolutely. Cost allocation is mapping the billing data back to the business itself. Then you can go on and do the other things. Mm-hmm. Cool. Absolutely. What else, Jason?
I don't know. I'd like to. Why don't we talk a little bit about MSRP, public pricing? Whatever the flavor of the week is. AWS calls it on-demand pricing or their on-demand rate. Azure calls it pay as you go. I don't remember what Google calls it. It doesn't really matter, but it is essentially MSRP, right?
Yeah, and I think the common terminology is it's on-demand rate, right? Which is when we think about what is the list price that you are going to pay for a particular service, and it does get referenced by all these by these different terms. But at the end of the day, what you're looking for is on-demand rate. Sometimes you'll hear people say on-demand equivalent, or you'll hear them say MSRP, et cetera. So on-demand rate is the bare bones base, not base, but the bare bones, no discount, no change, the public pricing for a particular service on demand.
And how does that?
Right?
Yeah, and how do? It's loosely coupled with amortized costs, right? Because you need to understand all this data kind of plays with each other, right? The on-demand rate is important to understand because I could have a discount on some of my services, right? So I'm not paying the on-demand rate on all of my services. And sometimes I have to pay up front for some of those services, whether it be for reserved instances or savings plans. I don't have to pay. I choose to pay up front for those services. So tell me a little bit about the concept of amortized costs and how that plays with what my on-demand rate, which tells me what my on-demand cost is.
Yeah, well, I think that sometimes folks can get confused with amortization and understanding it. And I think the simple way to put this is if you don't quite have a grasp of amortization yet, which is totally fine, get it. The way that we used to buy technology where we would make a capital purchase. We would say, all right, there's all these, server storage, whatever, widgets that we needed, and we'd purchase it up front, looking 3 to 5 years out. That had some capital costs. And so we might pay, let's say we're going to pay $3 million for that equipment, and we're going to amortize it over 3 years. That means that we are going to look at it as though it's an expense of $1 million per year. And you could divide that by 12 to break it down as to the cost per month. You could break it down into unit economics to understand kind of the cost per day or the cost per customer that you acquire. There's all sorts of ways you can look at it, but amortization is really looking at it from an accounting basis of understanding what that upfront cost looks like out over the term. Now, I'm oversimplifying it because there's concepts also of cost of capital and so on, which we're not going to get into right here, but just understanding the amortization is taking that upfront cost and understanding it over the term, what it would look like on a per billing period basis.
Right, and I think it's like because you want to understand if I've procured a savings instrument that I paid up front for, I can figure out what my true cost is on that by figuring out what my amortized costs are, so that I can compare it to what I would have paid from an on-demand perspective as well, which
that's right.
It's important when you're tracking what your true savings rate is, right, over the entire environment.
That's right. So how this plays into commitments is that you will buy a commitment for particular usage. And commitments are probably important for us to define as well, but let's assume a little bit of knowledge and we'll come back and we'll define this. But let's say I'm going to commit to using a particular instance for the next year. I can pay the on-demand rate, or I can commit to using it for that year and pay all up front. There's different ways to pay it, but let's use a simple example. I can pay all up front, and I'm going to lay out some dollars up front that you would amortize over that 12 months, and I'm going to receive an effective discount on the on-demand rate. And so when you're thinking about commitments, you want to think in terms of sort of amortization. How much am I paying up front? How much maybe do I have to pay for that service over time? So if I don't pay it all up front, I can choose to pay none of it up front and actually pay it monthly. I'll get less of a discounted rate. But that may make sense from a cost of capital perspective. We'll go to cost of capital in just a second. But you're going to look at what is the amortized cost for however much I pay up front over that particular billing period. And then that will be the cost, and it should be lower, right? It'll be a discount to the actual on-demand rate.
We got some finance peeps geeking out on this podcast right now with all that explanation and amortized costs.
Well, there's probably a lot of finance folks shaking their head right now going, Nick, don't explain it that way.
That's probably true. Well, but there's anything that we explain, there's going to be dissenters from half of it. So,
yes.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about. You've mentioned cost of capital a couple of times, and I know that we've talked a lot about some of the more like technical terms within the AWS environment as it pertains to cloud FinOps, but we do have some finance people that are cost of capital. You mentioned COGS. Cost of goods sold is another important one. So why don't we talk a little bit about cost of goods sold? Man,
I tell you what, over my career, the two things that I had to learn early on in my career, and the two things I wish every single engineer understood, well, three things actually that I wish they understood, but these two are really important, is cost of capital and COGS. Because it's absolutely critical to thinking about how you engineer a solution if you want to be really financially smart about it, to understand these two concepts. So first of all, cost of capital. Very simply, this is the cost to borrow money. So for a business, when you think about an outgoing cost on a monthly basis, and you have just some sort of expense, and you have some sort of cash flow in, you don't really have to think about cost of capital on those monthly expenses. What you need to think about cost of capital is if I'm going to buy down a bunch of monthly expenses by paying a bunch up front. So if I choose to take a $50,000 expense per month and pay $600,000 up front, it sort of looks like it's an even spread, right? But it's not, because there's a cost of that capital up front as if I were borrowing it. And the reason you think about it as if you were borrowing it, you may have that cash, you may not, is because how else could that capital be put to use? How efficient could it be? So you want to think about what's the cost of borrowing it. So let's use a fairly typical percentage for borrowing capital might be somewhere in the ballpark of 7 to 8%. And so you would actually calculate at what rate you're borrowing cash and pay for something up front would it actually create a win in that spread month over month. So certainly 50,000 to 600,000 would not, but 50,000 to say 400,000, if I were to pay 400,000 up front to pay down or to buy off a $50,000 expense, that would make a lot of sense with my cost of capital. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to think in those terms when you're thinking about upfront costs. 2 is COGS. So Jason, why is COGS really important for engineers to understand?
Oh, because most of what they do contributes to COGS. Most of it, for any company that's, let's just say, like Tenacity, right, as an example, generating revenue from the services that they provide through the public cloud, right? That's a very good example, right? I am going to allocate my cost to supporting my customers or anything that it takes to generate revenue. I'm going to allocate those costs to cost of goods sold, right? So a good example in the case of a software company, say like, I don't know, Snapchat or whoever you want to say that, that has a very large AWS bill, most of their, or a good portion of their cloud services will be allocated on their P&L to cost of goods sold or cost of services.
So let's go ahead. Can we define it really clearly for an engineer what the cost of goods sold is? So it is the cost directly related to supporting a sale
or generating revenue. Yeah, generating revenue.
So if you set up a customer, it costs something then month over month to keep that customer. That's COGS.
Correct.
You have to maintain that. There's no getting rid of that because you have that customer. So in order to get that revenue every month, you have to have paid that expense.
Right. A simple example is, let's say every customer I spin up gets a virtual server, either an Azure VM or a EC2 instance, and they get a new one that's dedicated to that customer. It's what helps me generate the revenue from that customer. The cost of that EC2 instance and any software development that may go on it would be, or whatever work that's going on a monthly basis will be attributed to cost of goods sold, because it is, if I turn it off, I stop generating revenue, right? Another good example is customer success. Your customer success team, which is directly helping you retain revenue, would also be costs of goods sold as well. And so it's really important to understand that, because the more expensive I make something or architect something, the less profit margins that we have in these particular examples. And that's why it's really important for engineers to at least understand it, because just understanding it is subconscious and it kind of guides you. It's a north star, right?
So this is where folks get into in a hot topic across the entire industry right now, because of the current kind of global economic situation and layoffs and everything that's going on. Is people are thinking about unit cost, and this is what they mean. The unit cost is the direct relation to COGS. So the more that you can drive a unit cost down, the more impact you're going to have on COGS and reducing it, and that means that you're going to drive profitability. There's only a handful of levers you can pull to drive profitability. And this is the one that engineers have a lot of power over. This is where you show your value.
Absolutely.
Jason, what other terms do we have?
I think we have one other term that we wanted to touch on, and I'll define it, and then we can wrap it up with that. So EBITDA was the last term to define. This is another one I know that you're passionate about engineers understanding, Nick.
That's right.
Yeah. So EBITDA is defined as earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And so it is. It's not really a word, but they figured out how to make a word out of that. An anagram, right, or whatever that is. Yeah, whatever that is. Anyway, so tell me a little bit about EBITDA and why it's important. Why you thought it was so important for engineers, or why you think it's so important for engineers to understand that term, and how it relates to the business.
This is one of the first things when I go into an organization, and I'm generally going into, if I'm not in an early stage company, I'm going into an organization to help them really prepare for growth stage, to really skyrocket. And what's incredibly important in that stage of the organization is understanding what your profitability is going to be. So you want to understand EBITDA, because you're going to make a bunch of investments, and sometimes that obfuscates this idea of profitability. So the first thing I want to do is I want to teach the entire team what EBITDA means. And then I want to pull away all the financial jargon about it and say, listen, let the finance folks worry about what EBITDA as an acronym means. What you need to know is that whatever percentage that is, that's our profit. That's our actual, like, how we think about valuing the business. And when we drive value, we want to drive a higher EBITDA, which means we got to lower expenses, lower COGS, so that each time we go get $1 of revenue, we're not dropping a whole bunch of dollars of expense down to the bottom line. So I want engineers to think about this, because over time, I know when they are aware of it, because I've seen it, I've been in organizations where we've done this, that when they're thinking about it, they will improve code, improve infrastructure over time to actually drive higher EBITDA.
Because everybody wants to make the right decision.
They're way smarter than me too.
Yeah, they just need the data to be armed with, the understanding the data to be armed with to make those right decisions.
Exactly. Why wouldn't you arm the smartest folks who have the biggest impact on it to go and do it? So this is, why I think it's really important to have a shared understanding and report out EBITDA to the team so they understand it and know it, and know that it's okay to have an EBITDA that's approaching zero when you're in growth stage, because you're reinvesting everything, but that you're projecting how you're going to get to a really excellent EBITDA that probably impacts outcomes for them in an early stage and growth stage company.
Well said, and nice note to end on.
Awesome. All right, everybody. That's the end of our show. Check out tenacity.ai. Go ahead and go download the FinOps handbook, cloud cost optimization handbook out there, and leave us feedback for the show. Thanks for tuning in.